Have you ever watched someone pushed so far that they turn the entire world against their enemies in one single moment? It started with 20 cabins that never should have been built, a smug woman in a white suit laughing in his face, and a man standing on a dam with everything to lose. One decision would wash away months of humiliation, but at what cost? Before we get into it, this is a story you won't forget. You've probably never seen a fight like this before. It's raw, real, and it's going to hit harder than you think. Before we jump in, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from so I know you're part of this. Have you ever seen a smile cut through humiliation like a blade? Keran in a spotless white suit steps onto the bridge with a clipboard and a grin that says the rules belong to her. Not the law, not the truth, not the man she's come to mock. She calls the cabin's progress and calls him small, and the word lands like a slap that doesn't leave a bruise but leaves a mark anyway. The kind that stings in the quiet hours when sleep won't come. The kind that makes a heart choose between breaking and hardening. He doesn't break. She laughs in front of the workers and the neighbors, and the cameras pulled out just to catch his reaction, and he answers with calm that burns hotter than anger. He tells her the land is not a billboard for cheap victories, that paperwork without honesty is confetti in the wind. She answers with a smirk and a line about market value and momentum, and the crowd snickers, and that's when the first twist hits. He smiles back, a small, razor-edge thing that unnerves even the ones who came to enjoy the show. Who smiles while being mocked? They rip out his boundary markers and call it alignment, call it cooperation, call it inevitable. He watches the posts fall like bones pulled from a spine. The workers clap for each other, recording themselves, bragging about deadlines and bonuses. He listens to the cheers. Then he asks the only question that matters, the one that makes even the loud ones go quiet for a beat. What happens when the bill comes due? If you were standing there, would you swallow it or send it back? Keran fires back that the deal is done and the future is settled. The man says nothing. He simply turns away, and that choice steals more attention than any rant ever could. The crowd leans, hungry for drama, disappointed by silence. But silence is a fuse when the right hand's light it. If you've ever felt your dignity auctioned off, press like and tell where you're watching from, because this is where people decide who they are. Night drops, and with it comes the second twist. The HOA hosts a celebration, music and selfies and victory speeches from a porch that did not exist a month ago. He stands behind what's left of his line and hears Keran toast the future. She calls him a footnote, and the word footnote is so small it makes the party sound larger. He could shout back. He doesn't. He writes names in his head instead. The surveyor who shrugged, the contractor who winked, the notary who stamped. Memory becomes a ledger. A neighbor drifts over with an uneasy half-smile, saying everyone just wants peace. Peace feels like a bargain made with the loudest voice. He nods, thanks the neighbor, asks how peace handles trespass dressed as paperwork. The neighbor stumbles, mutters something about compromise. Compromise is a fence no one intends to keep. The man thanks him again, and the neighbor leaves relieved and ashamed, because relief and shame often travel together. Keran approaches with her entourage, clapping slow, telling him to enjoy the show. He tells her a show ends, a story continues. She rolls her eyes and says stories are for people who can't afford reality. He answers that reality is a tide. She waves him off and promises a grand opening at sunrise. Sunrise becomes her trophy phrase, like a ribbon tied around stolen property. He walks away, and the third twist follows with quiet certainty. He doesn't head home. He heads to the one place that still answers to his name. Not to posture, not to grandstand. To remember. His hands move like someone replaying an old piano piece learned as a child, muscle and memory braided together by years and a promise made to a father whose hands once moved the same way. He pauses, breathes, thinks of what justice looks like when the courts forget to care. Morning edges in bright and loud. Keran performs for cameras, greeting furniture trucks like they're parade floats. She laughs with friends about stubborn men and outdated pride. He steps onto the bridge, not shouting, not begging, not broken. He looks at her, and the smile from the first scene returns, wider now, not cruel, just composed. The kind that says a deadline arrived exactly on time. She asks if he's ready to apologize. He says apologies should be honest and timely. She jokes that hers will come engraved and never sent. He nods like a teacher counting down the last seconds of an exam. She boasts about ribbon cutting and speeches, about sponsors and features, and a future that will forget his name. He says the future has a memory longer than a permit and sharper than a signature. She laughs again, louder, certain. Certainty can be loud right up until it isn't. Workers swagger past with new fixtures and plans, joking about naming rights and weekend rentals. A teenager in a branded shirt calls him grandpa, even though he isn't old, and the insult lands because contempt doesn't need accuracy. It feeds on repetition. He glances at the teen and says every generation thinks it invented gravity until the fall arrives. The teen shrugs and walks away. When bravado meets consequence, it usually arrives late to the meeting. Keran gathers her people for a photo and declares the place unstoppable. He replies that unstoppable is a word people use before something stops. She tells him to enjoy the view. He tells her to brace. She asks brace for what? He says for truth. The word truth lands with the weight of a name carved into stone. He turns, and that simple motion becomes the fourth twist. No raised voice, no drama. Just a man who has finally stopped bargaining with people who never intended to be fair. His palms are steady now. The decision is not rage, it is clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives when the last door closes and the last excuse ends. If you've ever been driven to the edge and felt that click inside your chest, the one that flips grief into resolve, drop a heart in the comments so others know they're not alone. He returns to the place where promises were born and broken. Keran keeps celebrating, still certain the land will forget him by lunch. He places his hand where his father's hand once rested, and the years collapse into a single breath. Somewhere behind him, laughter peaks. Somewhere ahead of him, the ledger turns its own page. He leans closer, and the air tightens around a choice that can't be unmade. The last line he gives them morning is small, almost gentle, a sentence shaped like mercy that decided to grow teeth. If they want war, he will give them one. His fingers tighten, and the world holds its breath as his grip closes on the wheel. Morning starts with laughter sharp enough to bruise. Keran in a white suit holds court at a table with her friends, retelling last night like a comedy. He was trembling. She says, he'll apologize by noon. Her friends sip confidence and nod. Trucks arrive with furniture, ribbons, a future she believes belongs to her. Every joke is a pin pressed into the same old wound, and the crowd learns to laugh on command. The man arrives without a storm on his face. He arrives with a smile. He doesn't shout. He walks to the bridge like someone returning a library book. Calm is louder than rage. The workers nudge each other and grin. He stands a few steps from Keran, hands easy at his sides, eyes steady. Congratulations, he says, because politeness hits harder when the other side expects chaos. She smirks and pats her clipboard, the gesture of a person who thinks paper is armor. Ready to make peace? She asks, or do you prefer to be yesterday's news? He says peace requires honesty. She says honesty is whatever gets stamped. He points once, not at the cabins, not at the trucks, but at the veins along his wrist. My father tuned these hands for one thing, he says. Keran squints, irritated that he refuses to deliver the tantrum she rehearsed to defeat. A friend teases that nostalgia won't pay property tax. He says memory pays a different bill. The table laughs. The laugh lands, then curdles. The first crack in the morning is always a small sound no one wants to admit they heard. He speaks of a dam built with sweat and promises, of summers spent learning the language of pressure and balance from a man who believed land is a trust, not a trophy. Keran taps her pen and calls it a bedtime story. Progress, she says, and winks at the cameras. He asks progress for whom? She says for people who know how to win. The workers clap. He nods, like a judge granting them permission to celebrate before sentencing. One last time, he says, I can end this in seconds. Keran throws her head back and laughs, so hard even her friends wince. And what? She says, the future. He smiles again, and this time the smile has weight. If you've ever been mocked while holding the truth in your bare hands, let your heart speak in the comments and tell us where you stand, because what happens next separates talk from consequence. He turns as if bored. That's the move that rattles them. Not anger. Dismissal. A worker calls after him to bring a lawyer. He keeps walking. His left hand trembles for a heartbeat, then goes still, as if an old instruction finally loaded in full. Keran mutters that he's harmless. and harmless is the word people use when they mistake restraint for emptiness. He reaches the place where his father taught him that power is not loud, it is exact. Back at the table, the jokes restart, but the rhythm is off. A friend whispers, "What if?" Keran hates the word if. If is the crack in a flawless mirror. She stands and waves to the crew to get everything ready for a ribbon. The crew shouts back, making noise to drown out the tiny sound of doubt growing teeth. She walks toward the bridge to cheer in his face, to score the final point before the highlight reel. He waits for her with the patience of a locksmith. Last chance, he says, not to win, but to walk away. She steps closer, sweet smile sharpened for cameras. The only thing walking away today is your pride, she says, and flicks her wrist like a referee, signaling a forfeit. He says pride is what you sell when you need attention. She rolls her eyes and calls for the ribbon. He places his palm on a past that never left. The old lesson moves through his bones the way a melody returns on the fifth note. He doesn't speak for effect. He speaks because a promise needs witnesses. This ends now, he says, not for revenge, but for repair. Keran claps in his face. She dares him to do something real. He breathes in, not like a threat, but like someone agreeing to a price. The first motion is clean. Metal answers muscle with a sound the body remembers before the mind catches up. A worker shouts that he's bluffing. Another worker curses the schedule. Keran freezes for one impossible second, then steps forward as if proximity alone can halt consequence. He keeps turning, steady, precise, silent inside, the way people get when their purpose finally matches their action. A low rumble pushes through conversation like a new law. Everyone hears it differently, as a promise, as a warning, as a sentence being read. Keran's eyes flash to his hands and back to his face. She calls him reckless. He says reckless is building a life on borrowed lies and betting no one will call the debt. Her mouth opens, then closes. She turns to her workers and orders a stop to something that no longer takes orders. He clicks through the last inches like unlocking a safe. The sound changes. Even the bravest sound small. A child nearby asks a parent if everything is okay, and the parent lies with the confidence of someone who needs it to be true. He lifts his hand away. What is done is done. He looks not triumphant, but emptied of hesitation, a vessel poured out on purpose. Keran marches toward him, white suit blazing like a challenge, voice rising, words sharpened to puncture. He doesn't flinch. This is not a victory lap. It is a reckoning. He tells her this should have been avoided. She calls him dramatic, because drama is easier to dismiss than guilt. He says consequences are impatient. She says he'll regret this. He says regret belongs to people who didn't try every other door first. The shift happens faster than anyone is ready to admit. Sound turns heavy. The ground hums under saws. Conversations clip mid-sentence. The workers stop pretending to be unimpressed. A friend at the table squeezes a cup until it folds. Keran's voice jumps an octave and orders someone, anyone, to fix what can no longer be called temporary. He looks past her, not cruel, simply finished with bargaining. You asked for proof, he says softly, and proof answers. The world takes a breath that tastes like judgment. Then the first impact arrives, not as a spectacle, but as a verdict. Faces change shape in an instant. Keran's smile fractures. Her eyes widen with a shock she cannot outrun. The beginning of everything they said would never happen reaches the cabins with the force of a promise kept, and the frame freezes on the moment her certainty breaks. The first wave hit like a secret no one could keep any longer. Water surged forward with a roar that drowned every joke, every laugh, every ribbon-cutting cheer. Cabins that had stood proud hours ago now rocked like toys, their foundations splintering, windows snapping as the force pulled them sideways. Workers who had been joking moments earlier were shouting now, some running for higher ground, others trying to grab tools, yelling over the rising chaos. Keran screamed orders, demanding someone shut it down, demanding someone undo what had been set in motion. Her voice cracked, but she kept shouting. Her perfect white suit streaked as she shoved past fleeing workers. The man on the bridge didn't move. He stood with his arms at his sides, his face like carved stone, watching everything he'd warned about unfold exactly as he said it would. For a heartbeat, the crowd stopped seeing him as the problem and started seeing him as the only one who had understood what was coming. A father splashed through waist-deep water carrying a child, yelling for someone to help his wife out of a tilted cabin. A teenage worker slipped and went under before another grabbed him by the collar and dragged him out, coughing and terrified. The sound of panic was no longer distant. It was everywhere. Keran turned back toward the bridge, hair sticking to her face, screaming that this was his fault, that he was a criminal, that she'd have him in cuffs before the day was over. He didn't flinch, didn't shout back. The quiet on his face made her angrier than any insult could have. She grabbed the rail with both hands and yelled at him to stop it. He looked at her like a man hearing a storm demand that the sea turn back. The sheriff's cruiser screeched to a stop nearby, doors slamming, boots pounding. The sheriff bellowed his name, ordering him to step away from the controls. Two deputies moved toward the bridge, hands near their belts, shouting for him to back down. The man didn't move. He turned once toward the cabins, then back toward the sheriff. "If I close it now," he said, "they will still lose everything. You let them build in a place that was never safe." The sheriff's face flushed. He shouted again, threatening charges, demanding compliance. But the water didn't care about threats, and neither did the man. Another cabin ripped from its base and spun away, crashing into the next one and sending both collapsing downstream. Gasps from the crowd turned into horrified silence. Keran grabbed the sheriff's arm, shouting that he needed to arrest him now, screaming about property value, lawsuits, the HOA charter. The sheriff raised his hand to silence her, something in his expression shifting as he watched the cabins go under. He grabbed the man by the arm, pulling hard, shouting that this was over. Before he could drag him away, a new voice cut through the noise, calm, commanding, and so certain that everyone froze. A man in uniform stepped out of a government truck parked just behind the cruisers, his presence cutting through the panic like a knife. The Army Corps patch on his chest caught the light. He ordered everyone to step back, told the sheriff to hold his position, told Keran to be quiet. Keran shouted that she had permits, that this was legal. The man in uniform told her the permits had been under federal review for months, and they were fraudulent. He pulled papers from his vest and declared the entire development an illegal flood zone construction. Every cabin was slated for demolition before the season ended. The crowd gasped, neighbors whispering to each other, pointing at Keran. For the first time all morning, Keran hesitated. Her voice cracked as she shouted that this was harassment, that she would sue everyone in sight. The engineer didn't blink. He said her HOA had endangered lives and violated federal law. The sheriff's grip on the man's arm loosened, then dropped entirely. His whole stance shifted as he realized who the real problem was. The man finally spoke, his voice quiet but sharp as glass. "I told you this land remembers." Keran's eyes widened, her fury mixing with something new, fear. The neighbors who had been silent began muttering louder, some recording with their phones, others yelling that they'd been lied to. Keran's composure cracked like the cabins behind her. She stepped closer to him, face red, pointing and swearing she'd make sure he lost everything, swearing this wasn't over. He let her rant, the corners of his mouth curling into the first true smirk since it began. The smirk that said the tide had already turned and there was no going back. If you think karma just hit like a freight train, smash that like button because it's only getting started. Keran ripped out her phone, taking photos of the dam controls, vowing lawsuits and revenge as she stormed away with what was left of her entourage. The man stayed on the bridge, watching her retreat, his expression calm, almost unnervingly so. The sheriff gave him a long look, one that said this wasn't the end, but it wasn't his fight anymore either. Neighbors were shouting now, calling out Keran's name, some cheering that someone had finally stood up to her. The water kept rushing. The cabins kept breaking apart. And as Keran disappeared down the road, she glanced back over her shoulder with eyes that promised the next strike wouldn't be on this bridge. It would be in a courtroom, on a news camera, in every place she could still hurt him. And that was the moment he knew this war had only just begun. The silence after the flood was almost louder than the flood itself. Keran's car hadn't even made it past the road when the murmurs started turning into shouts. Neighbors were yelling questions no one could answer. HOA members were scattering like the cabins themselves. The man stood still, letting it all wash past him, a quiet figure at the center of a storm. Then the uniformed engineer spoke again, and his words cut through the noise like a verdict. "The development is illegal," he said again, "every single cabin built on a zone that was marked as restricted decades ago." He said the permits were forged, the paperwork doctored. The words carried weight that made every HOA member freeze. Keran wasn't there to defend herself now, and that made it worse. One of the workers muttered that they'd been told it was all cleared. Another cursed under his breath and ripped off his HOA t-shirt, throwing it to the ground. The sheriff turned to the man, his face shifting from anger to something almost respectful. He nodded once, the kind of nod that says you were right all along, but I'm not ready to say it out loud yet. The man didn't speak, just let the truth hang there. The crowd was no longer looking at him like a criminal. They were looking at him like a man who had forced justice to show up. Keran returned minutes later, white suit smeared, hair wild, phone pressed to her ear as she shouted at someone about lawsuits. She saw the engineer holding the papers and charged straight toward him, demanding to see proof. He handed her the documents calmly, letting her read them as everyone watched. Her face changed with every line, anger melting into panic, then snapping back into rage. She tore the papers in half and threw them at his boots. "You think this stops me?" She spat, voice shaking. "You think you've won?" She turned on the man, pointing at him with a trembling hand. "I will take everything you own," she promised. He didn't answer. His silence made her angrier, like punching at smoke. The sheriff stepped forward and told her she was lucky no one drowned today. Keran glared at him like betrayal had just joined the party. The sheriff folded his arms and said the county would have to investigate, that her HOA funds were frozen until further notice. A cheer rose from the neighbors, raw and sharp, the kind of sound people make when they finally see a bully trip. Keran screamed at them, at everyone, accusing them of turning against her. But their faces told her everything she didn't want to know. Fear was gone. Authority was gone. Whatever power she had was slipping through her fingers like the water roaring below. The man took a single step forward. Not toward her, just toward the edge of the bridge. He looked at the remains of the cabins being pulled away, one by one, until the water swallowed the last of them. He turned back to Keran, and the look on his face was worse than anger. It was finality. He smiled, slow, deliberate, exactly like the one that had shaken her earlier that morning. "If you think karma just hit harder than anyone expected, smash that like button right now, because this fight is about to get personal." Keran spun on her heel and stormed away, snapping at her workers to follow her. She shouted that she would sue the county, sue the state, sue anyone who dared stand in her way. The sheriff called after her that she should get a lawyer for herself first. She didn't slow down. The man stayed behind, watching until her white suit disappeared into the distance. He wasn't smiling now, not exactly. It was something colder, quieter. Not satisfaction. Resolve. Because he knew Keran wasn't done. People like her never left quietly. She would come back harder, meaner, more dangerous. And when she did, he would be ready. That night he sat at the table with the engineer and the sheriff, going over everything that had happened, every warning he had given, every time they had ignored him. The engineer admitted that if the dam hadn't been opened, the first major storm would have wiped the cabins out and possibly killed people in their sleep. The sheriff let out a long breath and said he wasn't sure if he should arrest him or thank him. Keran didn't sleep that night. From her porch across town, she watched the news trucks roll past, cameras flashing as they took photos of the wreckage. Her phone lit up with messages from furious HOA members, from investors demanding answers, from developers threatening to pull their money. She poured herself a drink with a shaking hand and whispered that she'd burn him to the ground if it was the last thing she did. The man looked at the quiet water, hands resting on the rail, feeling the weight of what he'd done and knowing it was only the beginning. The night didn't feel calm. It felt like a pause before the next strike. And then his phone buzzed. A notification from the bank. His accounts were frozen. His name was trending on local news. The headline read, "Dam owner destroys community development, faces civil action." His neighbors might have cheered today, but tomorrow the headlines would turn them into a mob. He turned off the screen slowly, set the phone down, and sat back. Keran had moved first. The morning news turned him into a villain before breakfast. Anchors used words like vigilante and reckless, flashing pictures of him on the bridge with the dam wheel in his hand. Commentators debated if he had committed sabotage. Neighbors who had been cheering just a day earlier were now whispering when he walked by, some crossing the street, some pretending not to see him. Keran had moved faster than anyone expected, filing emergency injunctions overnight and convincing a judge to freeze his accounts. His bank card declined by noon. He sat at the table, staring at the stack of notices left on his doorstep. Property liens, HOA lawsuits, threats of civil penalties stacked like cards designed to crush him. The man who had stood unmoving on that bridge now felt the weight of every accusation pressing against him. For the first time since it began, he allowed himself to wonder if Keran might actually destroy him. A black SUV slowed near his driveway, tinted windows rolling down just enough for someone inside to take a photo before driving off. Minutes later, a news crew parked at the edge of his property, setting up cameras, shouting questions. Was he proud of what he did? Did he think of the families displaced? Was this revenge? Each question dug deeper, designed to paint him as the villain Keran wanted him to be. That night, the weight settled heavier. He sat alone, hands clasped, breathing slow, thinking of his father. Was this justice? Or had he just set fire to his own life? In that moment of doubt, a sound broke the silence, a soft slide of paper under the door. He stood, heart hammering, and picked up the envelope. Inside were photographs, grainy but clear enough to tell the story. Keran taking cash-stuffed envelopes from a developer's assistant, smiling as she signed documents with dates that didn't match county records. The twist hit like an electric jolt. Someone out there wanted him to fight back. He spread the photos on the table, studying each one. There was no signature on the envelope, no note, just the evidence. He felt the old fire return. Keran had frozen his accounts, dragged his name through the mud, but now he had something that could tear her entire empire down. He grabbed his phone and called the only person he trusted with this, an old friend, a veteran who had stood next to him in more battles than one. His friend answered with a dry laugh, saying he'd seen the news, asking if the rumors were true. The man told him everything, every detail, every threat, every piece of proof now sitting on the table. The friend's tone shifted from amused to deadly serious. "This is bigger than revenge," the friend said. "You have her cornered. Don't waste it on anger. Humiliate her legally. Make sure when she falls she can't climb back up." The man nodded, even though no one could see it. The plan began forming before the call ended. The next morning, he gathered everything and called a local reporter known for exposing corruption. The reporter hesitated until he sent one photo. 10 minutes later, she called back and set a meeting for that night. The man packed the envelope carefully, locking it away until the meeting. As he stepped outside, he felt eyes on him. The same black SUV from the night before was parked at the corner again. This time, two men got out. They weren't reporters. Their shoulders were broad, their suits too tight, and their walk too slow to be casual. They stopped at the edge of his driveway, one of them calling out that they needed to talk. His gut told him this wasn't conversation, it was intimidation. The man slid the envelope deeper into his jacket and stepped forward. If they wanted a message delivered, they'd have to get past him first. The first man smiled without warmth, telling him it would be easier if he handed over whatever he had. The second stepped closer, close enough that their boots almost touched. The man didn't back up. His pulse was hammering, but his stance stayed firm. And then the first one reached into his coat. The hand went into the coat, and the world narrowed to a heartbeat. The man moved first, not away but through, knocking the wrist aside with a sharp twist and driving a shoulder into the sternum. Air rushed out of the stranger like a punctured tire. The second one lunged, grabbing for the jacket where the envelope hid, and met an elbow that cracked across his jaw. No speeches, no warnings, just clean, practiced motion bought with a lifetime of being underestimated. They expected panic. They got precision. A step, a pivot, a heel to the knee, and the first one folded, cursing as his leg gave. The second threw a wild hook that met the man's forearm and died there, answered by a short, brutal punch that emptied thought and left him blinking in shock. The man didn't chase. He simply planted himself between them and the evidence like a locked door. You don't get past without a key. The taller one fished out a business card, as if a printed square could polish what just happened. The card fluttered to the ground, untouched. "Hand it over," he rasped, trying to sound like authority through a wince. The man's answer was a slow shake of the head and a glance at the curb where neighbors had started watching from behind their fences. Intimidation hates an audience. A slow clap rose behind the SUV, mocking, measured, familiar. Keran stepped into view, white suit pristine again, eyes bright with the kind of confidence that only money buys. She thanked her men for their service like she was tipping waiters, then told the man he had one last chance to be smart. He asked how much the chance cost. She smiled the way a person smiles before yanking a ladder away. "You think you won," she said, "because you made a mess. You didn't win. You poked something larger than your pride." She drew closer until the fabric of her jacket almost brushed his sleeve. "Withdraw the meeting with the reporter, return whatever you stole, accept our settlement, and this ends." He said it ends when the truth starts. Her nostrils flared. "Funny word," she said. "Truth bends. We bend it. Try to stop us." He let the silence hold. Then he tilted his chin toward the jacket pocket, not where the photos sat, but where a small red light glowed through the fabric. Keran's gaze flicked to it and back to his face, trying not to register the shift in the ground beneath her heels. The words she had just used didn't evaporate. They hardened. She recovered, switching tactics, voice lower, meaner. She called him sentimental. She said the cabins were a formality, a lever to pry his land loose for people with vision. She said the permits were a speed bump everyone agreed to roll over. She said envelopes move mountains, and, yes, she pushed them. Each sentence stacked like bricks in a wall she didn't realize she was building around herself. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. The taller enforcer found his voice and warned that accidents happen to men who don't listen. The man stepped toward him, and the threat died of embarrassment. Keran hissed at them both to get in the car. "Not yet," he said, and finally spoke to her, gentle as an undertow. "You talk like the law is a rumor. Let me introduce you to the microphone." He pulled the phone from his jacket and pressed send. The live stream had started a minute earlier, quietly, without drama. The red light was not a warning. It was a fuse already burning. Keran saw the chat counter jump, comments flooding in from neighbors, from people who had stood on that bridge yesterday, from strangers who knew the shape of this story in their own towns. The first words she managed were a whisper that sounded like a scratch on glass. "Turn it off." He didn't. He raised his voice just enough for the street to hear and asked her to repeat the part about bending truth. She refused, then raged. Rage loosened her tongue. She threw his father into it, mocked legacy, admitted what she'd laughed about in private for months: the kickbacks, the fake signatures, the cozy dinners where decisions arrived before agendas. Her men shifted, suddenly very interested in not being on camera. When she realized what she'd said, she lunged for the phone. He held firm. The scramble only made it worse. People watching love clarity. They also love clumsy cover-ups. The sheriff's name appeared in the chat from a verified account, a short line asking him to stay put. The reporter's name appeared next, 3 fire emojis and a direct message ping. "If you feel this moment in your chest, drop a heart in the comments so this confession doesn't sink under noise. Let the platform see what justice looks like when a community listens." Keran backed away, breathing hard. White suit no longer a symbol of control, but a spotlight on panic. She told the men to finish it. They didn't move. They had seen enough fights to recognize one that wasn't theirs anymore. Sirens started distant and grew teeth. The street's hum turned into a choir of doors opening, phones rising, murmurs sharpening into a verdict not yet formal, but already real. She tried one last angle, pleading with the camera, painting herself as a builder, as a protector, as the only adult in a town of sentimental children. The stream answered with receipts, with timestamps, with screenshots someone dug up of her speeches about progress that read different now under a layer of fresh truth. The man didn't gloat. He stood still and let the comments turn into a parade of witnesses. She pointed at him and called him a destroyer. He nodded once and said he had destroyed a lie. She told him he'd regret this when the lawyers circled. He told her lawyers like to be paid. She blinked and understood that frozen accounts cut both ways. For the first time, doubt wrote itself into the lines around her mouth. The SUV door opened, and she grabbed it like a lifeline, half in, half out, still performing for a crowd that had stopped believing in magic. She hissed that this wasn't over, that he had made enemies with long arms. He said arms look long when you're standing on a ledge. She slammed the door and told the driver to go. The vehicle didn't move. Sirens were too close now. He ended the stream and saved 3 copies. The phone vibrated with messages stacking faster than he could read. The reporter sent a location pin and one sentence that felt like a gavel. "Bring everything." The sheriff texted that units were inbound and to expect questions. The tone was clipped but cleaner than yesterday, like someone finally stepping onto the right side of a line. His friend called, voice all grin and gravel. You lit the fuse, brother. Now hold the line. The man exhaled for the first time in hours and said he would. The tremor in his hand was gone. Resolve had driven it out. Headlights swung across the curb as patrol cars arrived, tires kissing the edge of the street with urgency. Neighbors gathered tighter, whispers spreading timelines and names. The two men who had come to collect took one look at the uniforms and found religion in silence. The SUV idled with Keran inside, her palms pressed to her temples, the posture of someone calculating exits and finding none that didn't cost blood. The sheriff climbed out, jaw set, eyes on the man, then on the SUV. He lifted a hand not to threaten, but to claim responsibility for what came next. The engineer's truck turned the corner behind them, a second witness joining the first. The scene clicked into focus, players in their places, all the little lies outnumbered at last. Lights washed the street. Radios crackled. The edges of this war pulled tight around one truth too big to smother. And as the first unit stepped toward the SUV, the man's phone vibrated again with a notification that made his pulse kick. The reporter had posted the clip already. It was exploding. Then, over the rising sound of sirens and the crowd's low roar, a single metallic snap rang out from inside Keran's vehicle, sharp enough to slice the air, and every head turned in the same direction at once. The metallic snap turned the night to glass. Deputies shouted commands, hands on holsters, neighbors ducked behind fences. The SUV door swung open, and Keran stepped out with her hands raised halfway, her face pale but defiant, as if daring anyone to touch her. The sheriff's voice cut through the tension, ordering her to stand down. She ignored him, pointing back at the man with a shaking hand, screaming that he had ruined everything, that this was a setup, that she would not go quietly. The engineer stepped forward, holding up the official order, his voice calm but ironclad as he read the violations aloud. Each word stripped away what power she still clung to. Keran tried to shout over him, but the neighbors had found their courage. They shouted back, calling out every slight, every rule she had twisted, every fine she had handed out like confetti. The mob wasn't angry now. They were united, their voices cutting sharper than any siren. The deputies moved in. Keran thrashed, cursed, kicked, still in that spotless white suit as they pulled her hands behind her back. The man didn't speak. He just stood on the edge of the crowd, his jaw set, watching the queen of the HOA dragged past him in front of everyone she used to control. She locked eyes with him as she passed, her face flushed with rage and humiliation, spitting that this wasn't the end. The sheriff shook his head and told her the end had already come. Neighbors started clapping, some recording on their phones, some just smiling through tears. It wasn't celebration, it was relief, the kind of applause that follows a storm when people realize they survived it. The man turned and walked back toward the bridge, his steps heavy but steady. The chaos faded behind him, replaced by the sound of rushing water. He placed his hands on the rail where his father once stood, staring down at the dark current. For the first time since this started, he let his shoulders drop. Not victory, not pride, just a deep breath that felt like laying down a weight carried too long. The engineer joined him quietly, standing shoulder to shoulder. He told him the federal team would restore the land, remove the remains of the cabins, and reinforce the dam in honor of its original builder. He said the land would be protected now, permanently. The man nodded once, eyes fixed on the water, whispering that his father would have liked that. By morning, the reporter's story had gone viral. The live confession clip had been replayed thousands of times, shared across the county, and turned Keran into a symbol of greed undone. The HOA dissolved overnight. Members turned in their keys, their funds frozen, their charter revoked. Neighbors came to the man's porch one by one, some apologizing, some just saying thank you. A few brought food, a few brought letters. One brought his kid and said he wanted him to meet the man who saved their homes. The man just nodded, quiet but not cold. At sunset, he walked back to the bridge one last time. The water below was calm now, reflecting a sky that had traded storms for fire-streaked peace. He stood there for a long time, arms crossed, the same posture that had started it all, but this time the smile was different. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't defiance. It was quiet, a man finally able to breathe. If you stood through this fight and felt every twist in your chest, drop a heart in the comments so I know you're still with me. Hit like if you believe land and legacy are worth protecting, and subscribe because stories like this deserve to be told. Behind him, the last patrol car rolled away, taking Keran with it, her shouting still audible but weaker now, swallowed by the distance. The man didn't turn around. He stayed on the bridge until the lights disappeared, until the water was the only sound left, until the fight felt finished. When he finally stepped off the bridge, the war was over, not because he had won, but because there was nothing left for her to take. The cabins were gone, the lies were gone, and the land stood as it had before she ever came. Justice had not just arrived, it had stayed. And as he walked back toward his house, the glow from the bridge fading behind him, the screen froze on him one last time. Calm, unbroken, standing in the place where he had made the choice that changed everything.